Perfect. All right. So, like we said last week, like we began with last week, there are some stories in the Bible that are very easy to tell. There's some stories that they're natural, they're normal. You know, you can start with A and it goes to B and it goes to C and it goes to D and it kind of all flows together. And like children can tell these stories and adults can tell these stories and everybody can understand these stories and they're really great. And last week we talked about a story that wasn't that way. So this week let's talk about a story that is. The first story in the Bible is like that. The first story in the Bible is very easy to hear. It's very easy to teach. It's very easy to understand. It's very easy, to listen to. It's a story told by like really, really ancient people, very ancient people who like they were poets and they were philosophers and they were illiterate. You know, like there's stories they told well before anybody could write anything down, and so they're the kind of stories that were intentionally memorable. You know, the kind of stories that were intentionally meant to keep you so you could always remember what it was and not just remember what they said, but what it meant, right? And so I don't need to tell you the story of creation. You guys have heard it. I don't need to tell you the story of Adam and Eve. That, again, like you've heard it. But if you think about it, these stories are so easy that I can just say the story of creation and you should be able to remember certain things that you've learned. I should be able to just say like Adam and Eve and you guys know certain things. So like when I just say like the Bible talks about creation, you should probably or could in your head hear the line, in the beginning, God made the heavens and the earth, right? Like it's a very simple, very easy to remember thing. And the Bible talks about the creation and there's things that we should remember and there's things that we probably know. Like I could tell you that the creation is orderly, right? That God makes stuff that makes stuff. God makes stuff that fits together in a system, right? Like we've talked about that before. You've heard that before. You should remember that. Like God made a world that was filled with life, right? And not just life, but life that makes more life. That's how this whole thing works. Like if you notice, like there's flowers and there's trees and there's all sorts of stuff and bugs and huge animals and fish in the sea and everywhere you look, there's life because that's the way that God made it. You probably remember some preacher at some point telling you that in that story that we're told over and over that the world that God makes is good. And it is, and that's great. Like the world is a good, beautiful, incredible place that God made for us. I don't need to tell the story. You guys know all that already. And then we could talk about that God, right? Like you don't have, we talked a few weeks ago that we get God wrong a lot, and that's why God becomes a person. That's why he became Jesus. But there is a lot of stuff we can learn from God, just again, from the creation. We know that God is talking to himself or themselves. I don't know. It's weird. The pronouns are difficult when God is talking to God and it's a whole other thing. And he said, hey, let us make us in God's image. Let us make people in our image, right? Like the us and the our are in there. It's very confusing. God is plural is the point. Right? And God is generous and God is giving and God is creative and God is loving. Like we see all of those things from this initial story. And then it plays out when we talk about human beings. Like I already just mentioned that you and I are made in God's image. That's where we get that idea. You'll hear that in like every religion and every, just about everybody will tell you that in a positive way. And we read it in our very first story that God makes people in our image. When you see people, you're seeing a reflection of God. And that's an incredible thing to understand, not just about God, but about people. And then we learn that, it's diverse. Human beings were not made to be one thing. There's male, there's female, but we fit together. And we were meant to be together and partnered, and we're meant to have people that aren't alike working together, right? You see that about people. You see about people that people can be trusted. Right? At least God thinks so. Because God makes people to be partners of taking care of his very good creation. These are all things that you learn about people. It may be the most inspiring thing I always like to point out is that good thing, right? That God tells us that the creation is good, but then God tells us that the creation is very good with us. That word very is very important. To see that at the end of the day, the world is better with us in it than it is without, despite what like everyone popularly just says, like the world is actually better with us instead of without. All of these things are just part of the story. And the beauty of this story is that you have heard it enough times that you could recite it basically. Like maybe you get the order of the days wrong. That's okay. I do too. It's really hard to figure out like what day was what thing. Like it's just tough. Like but in general, like this is what God made and this is what people are, et cetera, et cetera. And this is all foundational information, right? When we think about who God is, when we think about who people are, when we think about who the world is, the way the scriptures are supposed to work is when we understand those truths, that when we think about those concepts, we apply the truths to them. So, for example, whether we're talking about a religious thing or not, whether we're talking about Genesis 1 through 3 or not, when we think about the value of people, we are supposed to take the concept of people as a concept, and we're supposed to remember, because we learn it in the scriptures, that the world is better with us than without. That should just be applied every time. So when we think about people, we should not think, oh man, what a plague on the world humanity is. We should be thinking instead, man, what beautiful creations we all are. What beautiful reflections of God we all are. And we're here to make the world a better place. And if we're not making the world a better place, we should quit doing that and be better. Okay. All of that to be said, we need to talk about sin. Because there's this thing about sin that Genesis teaches us, just so crystal clearly. And so very, very often, bordering on almost never, do we actually apply that when we talk about sin. When I say the word sin, you may give me a technical biblical term. Sin is breaking God's law. It's lawlessness. It's you may give something like I often have taught that sin is doing something that hurts, right? That if we sin, we do something that hurts somebody else, we do something that hurts us. That's a good definition of sin, right? We may just do the generic sin is bad stuff. Cool. Specifically, sin is bad stuff that we choose to do. Right, like nobody says that like a hurricane is bad news for people in the way, but we don't say that like that's sin. We don't say that because sin is a moral, ethical choice that people make. Right? I'm not saying anything like outlandish. Okay. The thing about it is the story of the first sin is very simple. God tells Adam and Eve, don't eat the fruit from that tree over there. And they're like, cool. And then one day they eat the fruit of the tree, and it's like, well, that was not cool. That's a story. Except I left a giant piece out. Before there was ever sin, there was a talking snake. There was a serpent. And let's not get hung up on whether that's literal or not. Like the biggest mistake we can make with these old stories is being like, was that literal? Stop. Stop. Take 5 seconds to think about what they meant instead of arguing through the mechanism through which they were trying to say it. Before there's ever sin, there is a serpent. Meaning, before anyone ever rebels against God, rejects God, does the wrong thing, does the bad thing, breaks God's law, does something to hurt somebody else, does something to hurt themselves. Before there is sin, there's the serpent who lied and deceived and misled people into thinking that black was white and white was black and up was down and down was up and everything was wrong that was right and everything was right that was wrong. Before there was ever a bad choice to do a bad thing, human people were deceived. Before there is sin, there is the serpent. And what that means is that before Adam and Eve, in the story, before Adam and Eve ever did a bad thing, before they ever made a wrong choice, before they ever rebelled against God, before they were ever perpetrators of sin, they were first victims of sin. The serpent lying was sin. The serpent deceiving was sin. The serpent tempting was sin. Eve was a victim of the serpent. Adam was a victim of Eve. There's a chain of command here. Before there is a conscious choice to sin, there is a victimization of being sinned against. Before Adam and Eve hurt anyone, they are hurt in the first place. This is how sin works. First comes the serpent, then comes the sin. In the story, before the serpent's there, Adam and Eve are just like being naked, naming animals, taking walks in the cool of the day, like just living their best life. Before any amount of sin at all, life is great, and they do not make the decision. The way the story is told, Adam and Eve, in order to make the decision to rebel against God, must be lied to first. If the lie doesn't happen, if them being hurt by the sin doesn't happen, they never sin. That's how the story is ordered. God makes people. Everything's cool. Here comes the serpent. Now there's sin. That's how the story is ordered. It's a very good story. You can teach it to kids. You can teach it to adults. Adults can teach it. Kids can teach it. It's an easy to understand, easy to digest story. And it's a vital one as we think about sin, as people who sin, living in a world where people sin. And having said all of that, well, Jesus' words make a whole lot more sense. You see, one day, a couple of disciples, James and John, they're brothers, they came to Jesus with a request. And I should mention, the Bible's funny like this. I love the humor and you see the humanity of the Bible. It's just recorded a couple different places. In one of the places, this is in the New Testament, it clarifies that James and John didn't ask Jesus anything. It was their mom. But that's humiliating. Like, if you've ever had your mom step in where she shouldn't, like, okay, look, if you're getting like bullied or whatever, that's bad enough. But if your mom steps in, it's like, well, let me talk to the bully. No, mom, it's gonna make it worse. I'd rather come home with a black eye every day than you talk to that kid. Stop it. All these moms are like, I'm a mama bear. Anyway, look. I just love, like, it's humiliating that this mom, like, the James and John's mom is like, well, let me go talk to Jesus. And so then, like, then Mark. I love Mark because Mark's like, that is embarrassing. Let's just leave it out. Let's just let everyone in the future let's just be cool to these guys, right? Like, let's just do them a solid. We'll just leave mom out. It's fine. So let's do what Mark did and forget about mom. So the way Mark tells it, James and John went to Jesus with a question. And it's kind of a neat question because it's like a faithful question. They seem to understand something. They're like, look, hey, we get that you're not just a prophet, you're not just a guy, that you have this kingdom coming. Like, we're not sure exactly what the Messiah means, but we're pretty sure that's who you are. So you're going to have a kingdom. And they said, when you are in your kingdom, could we have the best seats in the kingdom? Now, they're not talking about chairs, they're talking about authority, right? Like, you hear the term, like, that's so-and-so's right-hand man. That's what they're asking to be. They understand that Jesus is the king. They want to be like, 1A and 1B in the kingdom, is what they're asking. It is a perfectly reasonable request so long as you're like the most arrogant people in the world. Like, hey, Messiah, I want to be the best people. I want to be the best person ever in your kingdom because I think I am totally worth it. Like, they did not, like, mom of James and John did not raise boys with low self-esteem. Let's give mom credit. Probably because she steps in every 20 minutes. Anyway, so Jesus, it's funny because Jesus is like, guys, are we kidding? Is this a joke? Look, I don't know what you're even talking about. All I know is God's going to be the one to decide the order of stuff. Like, whatever God decides on that is whatever's going to happen. So, I don't know, be good and be better and maybe, I don't know. He said, but look, the other thing you got to understand is that, like, if you want to be like me, you're going to die, right? Like, you're going to suffer. Do you guys really want that? Is that a thing? Like, you think it's glamorous. You're just going to suffer and die if you're like me. Like, is that what you guys want? And it's just, this is a whole conversation. And so, look, it doesn't quite go the way James and John want, whatever. But this is what we read is kind of at the tail end of that. Because Jesus is talking to these disciples who are always arguing about who's the best. They're always arguing about who is the greatest. That's what they're always doing. And Jesus wants them to see that that's not how he views things. So this is what he says in Mark chapter 10 to the disciples. Jesus says, "Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first among you must be a slave of everyone else. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others, and to give his life as a ransom for many." We need to focus on that last part when we talk about what the cross is. So if you think about why does Jesus die on the cross, it just slips off the tongue. Why does Jesus die on the cross? Well, Jesus dies for our sins. Jesus dies for our sins. Jesus dies for our sins. Jesus dies for, like, we know that, right? And in our head, when we think Jesus dies for our sins, what we hear is Jesus dies for the bad stuff I choose to do, right? It's the way we explain the cross all the time, right? You did bad stuff, so Jesus dies. Look, there is a level to which that's true. But it's like half the story. It's like turning off the Chiefs game before they block the field goal. Some of us did that. Some of us, like, it's over. Walk away. 35 yards. Look, that's what it's doing, right? It's you're getting half the story, right? When Jesus explains his death, he gives his life, that's the death, as a ransom for many. A ransom is a very specific illustration. Somebody has been taken captive. Somebody is being victimized. Someone has been taken. And Jesus says, I have come to die to pay the price to bring them out of that captivity. Someone has been kidnapped, so I am paying the big bag of money and dropping it off so that we get them back. And whatever illustration you want to give, you can use Liam Neeson if you want. He has a very specific set of skills. He will find you. You know, like whatever illustration you want. That's dated. You know what the problem is getting old? That movie's like 12 years old or something. Like, nobody gets that. Even half the room's like, what? Liam Neeson. Look, I'm old. The point is, the illustration of I'm here to ransom many, to give my life as a ransom. What Jesus is saying is I am saving people who have been victimized by something. I am saving people who have been harmed by something. It is passive. To Jesus, the overriding message of sin is not that we've done bad stuff. Yes, we've done it. But the overriding message is not that. The overriding message is bad stuff happened to us. None of us chose to be born into the world we were born into. None of us chose to be the skin color we are, or whether we're good at stuff or not. We didn't choose to be smart or dumb. Some of us are very dumb. Nobody chose that. Nobody wakes up and is like, "Hey, I'm going to be an idiot." They just walk among us and they have no idea. No one chooses to be big or small or tall or short, or nobody chooses any of this stuff, right? We go through life largely, as much as we have choices, we go through life passively, right? We go through life it's that illustration. You play the hand you're dealt. It's like poker. We're given cards and you got to play them. And so Jesus says that the overriding message of sin is not that you played the cards wrong, of course we do, but that you were dealt those cards in the first place. That's the problem. The serpent comes before the sin, is what he's saying. And so for Jesus, dying on the cross for our sins is rescuing captive people who through no fault of their own have been victimized. It's the same reason why Jesus describes his mission as being a doctor here to help sick people. It's the same reason the Apostle Paul talks about how we are slaves to sin, and when we have new life, we are freed from slavery. These are all very specific illustrations to explain that people who sin and do bad things are people who have been sinned against first. Hurt people, in other words. And people sin because they've been sinned against. all of this is vitally important when we talk about the story of the woman at the well. We talked about her last week. We told the story basically in broad terms. We started this series of basically it's one giant sermon of 3 weeks here. But the basic outline of the story is that Jesus goes through Samaria. He meets this woman who is a Samaritan woman, and they have this theological conversation, and he ends up telling her that she's the Messiah. She ends up going to tell other people. They end up bringing those people to Jesus, and a whole bunch of people end up believing in Jesus. Basic outline of the story. But one of the pieces of the story that we generally are taught, that we basically think about, is that this woman is a sinful woman. She's a woman of sin. That is like her, like that's the thing we all think about with her. She's a sinful lady. And that's just when we go into the story, like we've been taught it 100 times. Well, she's a sinner. 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 And I got to tell you, I don't know that that's a fair estimation, at least the way we think about it. She is sinful. But the problem is, much more than she's a woman who's done a bunch of bad stuff, she's a woman who's had a bunch of bad stuff done to her. Let me back up a little bit. So we talked about last week, part of the story is that when Jesus is talking to her, he has to kind of prove that he is more than just a random dude sitting at a well asking for water. And one of the ways he does that is he tells her something that only he could only know if he was a prophet. And she says, "Oh man, like you could only have told me that if you were a prophet. You must be a prophet." It worked, as it turns out. Jesus tried to prove that he was more, and he did. But one of the things, like the thing that he says is they're talking about this living water stuff. We'll talk about that next week, and that's week 3. And as we talk about this whole thing, Jesus says, "Go get your husband." And the woman sort of like, I mean, she's not lying, but sort of like evasively is like, "Well, I don't have a husband," which is absolutely true. But also true is the fact that she's had 5 husbands, and the man she's living with is not her husband. And Jesus tells her that. And she immediately is like, "Whoa, there's no way you could have known any of that. Like, you're a random Jewish dude who just walked in off the street. There's no way you knew all that about me, so you must be a prophet," and they move on to the conversation. She's not offended by it. It's just, what happens in the conversation. Based on that, what we do is this, as modern people. We take 5 marriages and shacking up with number 6, and we say, well, then she must be a woman of loose morals. Is that the way they used to? That's probably the nicest way I can say it. She's a woman she's lived a life, is what we say. Because in our world, we take certain things for granted. We take for granted that in our world, if somebody has 5 marriages, we mentioned this before. Like, if you got a friend who keeps talking, like you got a girlfriend, and like she's always talking to you about these boys she's dating, and the guy is always crazy. Like, we've talked about this, right? It's not the guys who are crazy. When you get to like 10 of them, like that's you. That's a you problem. Like, every dude in the world is not crazy. No, you're nuts. Yeah. Yeah, same. I could swap those genders if you feel like it. Just do whatever is less offensive to you. Right? That like when people keep having problems, like it's like if somebody's gone through like 15 jobs, like it's probably not that every boss is mean. You probably just don't like having a boss. Is probably all it is, which is fine. Start your own business. But the point is, anyway. So in our heads, this woman probably like did something, right? But we talked about this last week, and we need to apply the information. In the ancient world, marriages were arranged, and women didn't choose them. Ever. In fact, it was not legal in ancient Israel for a woman to divorce her husband. The law of Moses was written in a very specific way. Men can divorce their wives. That's a period. There's no, and women can divorce their husbands. That sentence doesn't exist. Men can divorce their wives. One of the great debates of the ancient priests and teachers was, for what can you divorce your wife? And there were some teachers that are like, you never should. God doesn't want you to. God meant for you to take care of this woman. You should do it. There was like 3 of those. And then there's like 1,000 of them that are like, hey, well, I mean, she's not a good cook. Like, I hear the chick down the road, like, I mean, she makes a mean, meatloaf. And I haven't had a good meatloaf in years. And I'm not kidding. That's true. That's like, these are real. There's literally a dude who's like, she keeps burning your dinner. You should divorce her. That guy's writings were preserved. Like, that guy wrote that down, and other people were like, keep it forever. We need people to share that information 4,000 years from now. Which is to say, I don't know why this woman's gone through 5 husbands. Maybe she's unpleasant. Maybe she can't cook. Maybe she can't have kids. I don't know. But the 5 husbands, what I know, did not end their marriage with her because she left. They left. 5 times. I mean, maybe they all died. But I feel like you'd catch that, right? Like, if you could probably get away with killing 3 husbands. They don't have DNA. But like 5 is a lot. I feel like they would have probably not dead. The point is they left her. She's a victim here. And interpreters for 2,000 years had the audacity to blame her for that. Yeah, she's living with another guy that's not her husband. It's not what you're supposed to be doing. Okay? But look, when you're 0 for 5, are you really going to pick 6? And I don't mean the woman, by the way. Like, would you marry the woman who's been married 5 times? And we don't know the reason. They would have known the reason. Of course not. She's doing what she can do to survive. You know what she's trying to avoid with that living with that man? Homelessness. Patriarchal world. Women don't work. And so this woman that we say is sinful is in fact a woman who's been victimized by sin. And that leads to our second reason that we often think that she's a sinner. There's this fact that she's gathering water at noon. But it's funny, it's not that we've said that just makes it even sadder. You see, here's the deal with the noon thing. Noon is the hottest time of the day. Like, they don't have electricity back in the day, so they're governed by, like, where the sun is every day. And so you would get up, like, the first time you see, the sun, you go and you do, like, a lot of hard work, like, super early in the morning, so that way you don't have to work under the heat of the sun, because that's awful, right? Everybody, like, you guys know how the sun works. So women every day would get enough water for that day, and they would go to the well, and it's heavy, right? So they would go to the well when you don't want to be hot, so they would go right at the daybreak. And so, like, if you imagine, like, in village, like, it's a water cooler, it's like that. It's like a well. Like, every woman in the village would go at sunrise to go get in line to get the water. And of course there's a line, and of course everybody's going to talk. This is like a social thing. Of course the women are all just going to hang out for like, oh yeah, it took me 2 hours because they're, Sally's hanging out with Martha or whatever. I'm just kidding. There's nobody named Sally. They're all just Mary or Martha. So there's 2 names in the ancient world. So the whole thing, like, it'd be like a social gathering, right? Well, if you're going at noon, you've decided that the heat of the sun is better than that social gathering. And so we say, well, she's a social outcast. Everybody hates her. And it's probably true. I have no reason to question that. I think that's pretty good. It's pretty good insight. But once we've established that, like, she didn't choose to be in these marriages, she didn't unchoose to be in these marriages. She's a victim. What that means is her entire village now hates her for something that's not her fault. I mean, look, I'm sure this woman is not like awesome. Like, I don't know that any of us would want to be friends with this lady. I don't know. Like, I have no idea what her personality is. She is a little mouthy with Jesus, okay? Like, I don't know. Like, maybe, like, I have no idea. But what I know is whatever she is that she has chosen to sin, she comes by it honestly. We can understand. She's been victimized by at least 6 men, probably more, in various ways. Her entire culture is blaming her for it. She has no friends. She's stuck in such a social conundrum that the literal heat of the sun is better than dealing with people. Yeah, this is a woman who is victimized by sin everywhere. The sin of the systems that she lives in are just they're just oppressive and tyrannical, and she can't get away from it. And it makes the story so beautiful that Jesus treats her like a human being. He treats her like a man, honestly. He treats her like one of his disciples. He shares with her information. He gives her dignity. It's just so beautiful. And it makes the story so much more incredible to me to see that Jesus is treating her with the understanding that the serpent is there before the sin, and he's not here to come down on people. He's here as a doctor for the sick, to pay the ransom, to free the slaves, all of that. And that's nice. And I should probably just end the sermon there, because then it's nice, and we just go home and it's nice. But see, here's the problem. Isn't it easy just to assume that this woman is just awful? Like, we've all heard this story 100 times. I've taught it. Isn't it incredibly easy just to buy that, like, yeah, this woman is just awful? The Bible's like that. You know, the Bible gives us snippets of information about people, and so it's easy to judge from that. I guess what I'm asking is, isn't it easy to think that other people are awful, especially when we see that they've sinned? I guess what I'm asking is, isn't it easier to assume that sin is just bad stuff people do and not bad stuff that happens to people? And therefore, the notion of sympathy and empathy and compassion and understanding, we don't have to worry about that because they're just bad people. Why do I need to empathize with somebody who's just bad? They're just wrong. Why do I need to try to connect with somebody and understand where somebody's coming from when they're just incorrect? Isn't it easier to do that? I mean, I'll tell you, it is for me. Especially when I've got, like, well, they did this and this and this. It's very easy to be like, well, that's why I don't like them. We're done. Like, we have forever just told this story as if the woman is this horrible person when that is in no way in the text. Did you know that, like, unless there's a crazy translation somewhere, the word sin or sinner is nowhere even in the story of the woman at the well? Why would we talk about her like she's a sinner? Jesus doesn't. It's not even there, and we put it in because it is easier to judge people when we just think, well, they're bad people who do bad things. It is far simpler to do that than it is to look at somebody who's different than us, who thinks differently, who believes differently, who sins differently, and say, well, I wonder how they got to be that way. Now, look, that doesn't justify anything. There's reasons why, like, a serial killer kills 17 people and eats 12 of them, okay? Like, I'm not saying that's okay, so we just say, well, I understand now, so, like, eating people is fine. It's not what I'm saying, okay? Obviously, like, you make your decisions, but isn't it helpful to know why people might eat somebody? If nothing else, to stop from happening in the future? Isn't it, and when you get away from eating people, most of the time we're not talking about crazy stuff like that. Like, isn't it more useful to know why people might be the way they are? And wouldn't that be what we would want for ourselves? That when we do bad things, that when we are the hurt people who are hurting other people, wouldn't we want the compassion for ourselves? Like when you do bad things, don't you want to say, yeah, but? Why do you want the yeah, but? But there's no yeah, but for other people. And you might think, what are we even talking about, Drew? I'll tell you exactly what we're talking about. Matthew chapter 7, this is what Jesus says. He says, do not judge others and you will not be judged, for you will be treated as you treat others. The standard you use in judging is the standard by which you will be judged. Holy cow. That's going to be on the Mount Rushmore for Drew's least favorite verses in the Bible. I don't like that one. Because I got to tell you, I'm super good at being judgy. I'm real good at it. And it's weird because sometimes we ask, like, well, what does Jesus mean? Does he mean, like, is this what God is doing? Is this what people are doing? And what I love about Jesus is sometimes when he's super vague, vagueness allows us to put it over everything, right? So, like, if it's like a template that you can just kind of chuck over everything. It's like, like you can cook. You can start the beginning of every meal with like onions, garlic, carrots, and celery. Like if you just stick that in a pot, that's the beginning of like 80% of meals. Like it's intentionally, that's the way it is. It applies to everything. That's how Jesus' teaching is working. He doesn't tell us that that's God. He doesn't tell us that it's people. He doesn't tell us that it's people we like. He doesn't tell us that it's people who don't. He's just saying this is the principle. You get back what you give out. And that is distinctly bad news for those of us who see the world as the kind of place where sin is just bad stuff that people do and they deserve what they get on the back end. If we want mercy from people, from God, it doesn't matter. If we want compassion, if we want understanding, we cannot ask for those things and not expect to give them in return. This is the challenge of Christianity. Like, if Christianity was a thing you lived by yourself, it'd be so easy. But see, the world is filled with women at wells. And we are that woman at that well. The world is filled with people who have sinned because there was a serpent. The world is filled with people who need ransomed and who need a doctor. And the irony is when we find that, so very often we become the reasons why people need a doctor in the first place. Like we find salvation, we find grace, we find mercy, and then we're like, yep, all that's for me and none for you. And then those people are traumatized by us, and now they need even more help. But even beyond that, boy, is it an unpleasant way to live. To just walk around life thinking, well, I've got a judgment on everybody else. I'm never going to show compassion. I'm never going to think about why somebody might be the way they are. I'm just going to think the worst of them automatically and just assume that must be the truth. Man, I got to tell you, I have known a lot of people who live their lives like that. I've known none of them who are happy. There's something to this Jesus thing where he says this is the way life should be. There's something to it. It's not just about going to heaven. It's about actually surviving tomorrow emotionally. And what Jesus wants us to see is, look, yes, people do bad things. But more than that, people have bad things done to them. And whatever level of compassion and understanding you want, it is incumbent on you to offer it to other people. Because Jesus is out here and he understands. Jesus treats this woman with compassion and love and grace. He simply asks us to give to others what he has given to us. This morning, we're in our second week of our series called The Woman at the Well. We give our second lesson. Next week, we'll finish it. But we got a second lesson from this series, which is really just a giant sermon. This is our lesson. People sin because they are captive to the ways they've been sinned against. So Jesus offers mercy and love, not judgment. People sin because they're captive to the way they've been sinned against. So Jesus offers us mercy and love, not judgment. Those lessons are getting too long. I got to get less wordy there. Anyway, the point is, we're having an invitation. You should get baptized if you haven't. You should join the church if you want to. And that's all. It's the same invitation every week. If you're confused, go listen to another one. We're gonna sing a song. You guys know this, and let's go.